What is going on, everybody? Today we've got NFL Mock Draft 2.0 on the slate. 2 rounds, no trades. I'm probably going to implement trades in most of my mock drafts going forward, but we're not going to do it today. This is a predictive mock draft, what I believe will happen, not necessarily what I would do if I was the GM of every team. That's going to come a lot closer to draft day itself. It's been a few weeks since Mock Draft 1.0. I think I uploaded that video on the day the NFL playoffs have started. And it's been a few weeks. Obviously, a lot has happened. We know our Super Bowl matchup now. Shrine Bowl week and Senior Bowl week have both just wrapped up. And I wanted to have 2.0 uploaded after those just so we could see how certain players performed in each of the All-Star game settings and to figure out if their stocks have gone up or down. This year in particular, I'm really trying to find certain players who I think the league is going to be higher on than the media and try to have those guys higher in my mock draft than where you're going to see them anywhere, along with other players who are just trending upwards. Jackson Powers-Johnson's a really good example of this. In mock draft 1.0, I had him in the first round when nobody was really talking about him, and now 3 weeks later, after a great Senior Bowl, he's a lock to go in the first round. So I'll give myself a pat on the back there. Let's not waste any time. Let's get this show on the road. So with the first pick, I had the Bears selecting Caleb Williams, the quarterback out of USC. I've talked about the decision that the Bears have to make, whether it's on the last mock draft or on one of the podcast episodes. But long story short, I would be very surprised if this is the route they don't go with. I think Justin Fields probably will get traded. Again, there's no trades today, but I would presume Justin Fields gets traded for something in the ballpark of like a second round pick and then maybe another mid to late round selection from a team like the Falcons or the Raiders, or maybe some surprise team swoops in and get him. Washington at 2 gets Drake Maye, quarterback out of North Carolina. Again, I think this one is going to be pretty easy. I've seen some people penciling in Jayden Daniels here. I personally think that Drake Maye is 100% the better prospect, and I think the Commanders will ultimately agree there. Big arm quarterback, he can make all the throws. Maybe he's not as impressive out of structure as, say, Caleb Williams, but I think this is the easy choice here for Washington. I personally believe he's clearly a better prospect than Jayden Daniels. New England at 3 is really where the draft starts. Do they go quarterback or do they go best player available? And it really comes down to how they evaluate Jayden Daniels. If they believe he can be a legitimate franchise quarterback, they are going to pick him. If not, they could go in another direction, whether it's a trade back or if they stick and pick. I would imagine it would be Marvin Harrison Jr., the wide receiver out of Ohio State. The more I think about it, the more I think the Patriots are going to talk themselves into going with Jayden Daniels. I personally would probably pick Marvin Harrison here, and I get the argument against it. When you have the opportunity to get a pretty good quarterback, you have to take it. I'm personally not all that sold on Daniels as a top 3 pick, at least not yet. So I would personally take Marvin Harrison and look to wait a few years and hope that you can get somebody else, maybe trade for Justin Fields. He's going to cost a lot less than the 3rd overall pick. But I think New England could very well talk themselves into it, and I would completely understand it. Jayden Daniels is the 3rd best quarterback in the draft. Even if I don't necessarily agree with the decision, I get it. So that means that the Cardinals here at 4 have a pretty easy choice. They get lucky. It's quarterbacks in the top 3, and they get Marvin Harrison Jr. Not a whole lot to go over here. This feels like a no-brainer. This will be a slam dunk pick for Arizona. The Chargers at 5, I had a hard time with this one, deciding between Malik Nabers and Brock Bowers. I could totally see Jim Harbaugh just wanting to get a big-time tight end in there. Brock Bowers is not a prototypical tight end, though. The guy is an absolute weapon. But I think Malik Nabers is too talented. He's too explosive. And having a legit alpha receiver in your offense can completely change things. I think pairing him with Keenan Allen and having Keenan Allen as a mentor is going to work out really well in that offense. And I think the value here with Malik Nabers is absolutely worth it here at pick 5. But I could very well see it being Bowers, who won't have to wait too much longer to hear his name called. He's going to go to the Giants here at 6. And I can understand why people are a little bit surprised by this. They traded for Darren Waller last year. They have Daniel Bellinger, who I think they do like. But the way I see it is they want this dominant physical receiver at tight end. They traded a top 100 pick to the Raiders for Darren Waller to do so. It didn't exactly work out. Waller appears to be regressing. So why not get a much better version of him in the long term with a guy like Brock Bowers? I think this could really tempt them, and it would be hard for them to pass him up, especially with Malik Nabers off the board. If Nabers was still there, I think this would be a different conversation. Odunze very well could be in play. Maybe they want to go to the offensive line, look at a guy like Joe Alt, but I think they're going to be really intrigued by the all-around talent that Brock Bowers is. I personally don't think that Bowers makes it out of the top 10. I have seen some mock drafts that have him going all the way towards the middle of the first round. I think it's going to be similar to Kyle Pitts, where the guy's too good of a football player to pass up. The Titans here at 7, again, another pretty easy pick. Their offensive line is a train wreck. Joe Alt is still on the board. Just run the pick up to the commissioner. That was an easy one. Atlanta at 8 was not so easy. If I let myself have trades here, this 100% would have been a trade back spot. I think Atlanta probably looks defense in the first round, especially one of the top edge rushers. But there's no trades here. Odunze is still on the board. And yeah, I get that they've drafted 3 offensive skill position players in the top 10 3 years in a row. But I think Odunze really fits what they could be looking for, adding another receiver alongside London and Kyle Pitts. And I think the value here is too good. I think they're going to look to potentially scoop him up if he's on the board. The Bears at 9 go with the top defensive player off the board. Maybe not who everybody would have expected here. In my last mock, I had them getting Dallas Turner. I had them sticking with edge rusher, but I had them picking Jared Verse out of Florida State. And Jared Verse is a really interesting prospect because he could have declared for the draft last year. He probably would have been a top 10 to 15 pick, but he decides to return to school where he really struggled at the start of the year. He lost some of his stock, but he built it back up down the stretch with a couple great games late. And I think his versatility on the line and his consistent pass rushing pedigree with the Seminoles over the last couple of years is going to make the Bears want to go this route. Their defensive line has certainly gotten better with some of the young pieces they added, but they need more talent, especially at edge. And I think Jared Verse has a shot to be a really good player in that defense. The Jets at 10. This is an interesting spot here because obviously they need offensive line, very similarly to the Titans. No brainer. You'd think this would be an easy Olu Fashanu pick. I actually had them going with Talise Fuaga out of Oregon State, who I think some teams are going to like better than Olu Fashanu. So the rationale behind this pick is that Fuaga has been really consistent over the last few years. He's got tackle guard flexibility. He performed really well during Senior Bowl week. And even beforehand, I was starting to lean on Fuaga possibly being the second tackle off the board over Olu Fashanu, who quietly was pretty inconsistent this year. He really struggled in the Ohio State game. And I could see the Jets passing him up for Fuaga, who can play a bunch of different spots on the line. With the 11th pick, the Vikings go with Dallas Turner. Danielle Hunter's a free agent. Whether he's back or not, I think they're going to want some more juice up front, and I think Dallas Turner definitely gives them that. The Vikings could look corner here, but they've drafted defensive back early often over the last couple of years. So on one hand, it makes me feel like that this regime really values defensive back early, and you can think about like a Nate Wiggins or a Terrion Arnold or even a Quinion Mitchell here. But I think the Vikings are going to look to go pass rusher here, and with Dallas Turner on the board still, I think this would be a pretty solid pick. Denver at 12. This is where things get very fascinating. So I feel like every year at this stage of draft season, we mock way too many quarterbacks in the first round. And for a while, I really felt like there would only be 3 QBs going in round 1 this year. Obviously, Caleb, Maye, and Daniels. But the more I think about it, I think there are some desperate teams looking for quarterbacks, more so this year than ever, especially here between picks 11 through 13. Kirk Cousins is a free agent. The Broncos are exiling Russell Wilson. And who the hell are the Raiders going to start? They cannot trot out with Aiden O'Connell next year. So I think all 3 of these teams could be in play for a quarterback. I think Denver's going to be the most desperate, though. I could see Sean Payton wanting to mold his own prospect, and I don't think Russell Wilson's going to be back next year. Of the next group of quarterbacks between Nix, McCarthy, and Penix, I personally believe that Bo Nix will be the top one of that group off the board. and the most likely to go in the first round. And I understand some of the arguments against Bo Nix. He's an older prospect. He played in a gimmicky college offense, but this is still somebody who can make all the throws. He's got all the physical tools, and I think he's going to be QB4. I think there's more concerns with the other quarterbacks. With Penix, it's age, injury, inconsistent play. He didn't play great against Michigan in the national title. And then with J.J. McCarthy, it's pretty obvious. Michigan didn't hand him a big load on offense. Pause. And I think Bo Nix has shown more flashes, and he's been more impressive as a passer, which is why I think it's the most likely of that next group of quarterbacks that he goes in the first round. And I think the Broncos could be a very reasonable landing spot for him. The Raiders at 13 get Olu Fashanu. His slide ends. He's not going to fall that far, but I do think there's a decent shot he goes later than people expect. The Raiders do have Colton Miller at left tackle, but you got to remember this is an entirely new regime with a new GM, Tom Telesco, coming over from the Chargers, who have not been afraid to draft offensive line early. Colton Miller only has one more year left on his contract, and Fashanu is arguably the best player on the board, so I think this pick would make sense for the Raiders. The Saints at 14 get Byron Murphy, the second out of Texas. His stock has really risen over the past few weeks, and he's really starting to get first-round buzz, and I can see it. Really impressive as a pass rusher coming in through the interior. Pretty solid run defender as well, and he's really improved throughout his collegiate career. This year in particular, alongside T'Vondre Sweat, he was very impressive. The Saints did draft Brian Brzee in the first round last year, but their front unit is lacking some high-end young talent, and I think they very well could look to add some more here. I definitely believe there's a real shot that Byron Murphy could be the top interior defensive lineman off the board, even before Jer'Zhan Newton, which might feel like a little bit of a surprise, but Newton's a little bit undersized. I think there could be some questions with that, and Byron Murphy was arguably better this year. The Colts at 15 finally get the first corner off the board. I believe that'll be Terrion Arnold. I wouldn't be surprised if he goes earlier than this. I think this is the floor for Arnold. This is just kind of how the board played out, especially this year with all the talent at corner. I think teams could maybe look to wait a little bit, realizing that they can get somebody pretty good on day two. The Colts are going to capitalize here, getting an awesome player here with Terrion Arnold, who had a phenomenal redshirt sophomore season with the Crimson Tide. At 16, I have Seattle getting Jackson Powers Johnson, the interior offensive lineman out of Oregon. We talked about him at the beginning of the episode as a guy who, I told you 3 weeks ago, I think he's going to go in the first round. And sure enough, he ends up here in round one after a ridiculous Senior Bowl week. Had an outstanding junior season with the Ducks. He can play center. He can play guard. Probably will play center at the next level. Seattle might need all of those spots. Their entire interior offensive line is not under contract this upcoming year. So this felt like a pretty easy pick for me. I think the value is absolutely fair. I get the argument that an interior offensive lineman might not be worth the 16th overall pick, but I think Jackson Powers Johnson is good enough to be selected here, and Seattle's going to need some more help up front. They've got their two bookend tackles, but their guards and center are not under contract next year, and if they don't make a move there in free agency, don't be surprised if they look at Jackson Powers Johnson here. Speaking of big-time Senior Bowl risers, Quinyon Mitchell, the cornerback out of Toledo, will go to the Jacksonville Jaguars here at pick 17. I was really curious to see how Mitchell would perform coming into the week because obviously he's been great in the MAC over the last couple of years, but he played in the MAC, not necessarily a ton of NFL receivers, so I was really curious to see how he would line up, and he dominated the one-on-one drills. He was one of the best players in Mobile, period, cementing himself as a lock to go in the first round, in my opinion, and in contention to be the top corner off the board. I understand receivers the bigger need for Jacksonville, but I think looking at receiver even more so than corner, there's so much talent in this class. You can get somebody good in the second round and afford to wait. And I think it's a little bit early for a lot of the receivers. The only guy I really thought about here was Brian Thomas Jr. out of LSU, but I think Quinyon Mitchell's the better prospect, and I think that would make more sense for Jacksonville. The Bengals at 18 get J.C. Latham, tackle out of Alabama. The board played out pretty well for the Bengals. Only 4 offensive linemen have been picked so far. You got to get more guys up front for Joe Burrow. He's suffered 2 season-ending injuries already. You got to protect your golden goose. Latu goes to the Rams here at pick 19, staying in Los Angeles. In terms of looking for a polished edge rushing prospect, you're not going to find many guys who are more refined than Latu. 27 sacks over the last couple of seasons, consistent pressure guy, dominant across the board as a pass rusher. Now, he's not going to test the best athletically, and that does limit his ceiling a little bit. And he's also got some medical question marks, but he's a damn good football player, and I think the Rams would really love to add him to their defense and add a partner on the other side of Byron Young, who quietly had a pretty solid rookie year at edge. The Steelers go with Nate Wiggins, cornerback out of Clemson here at pick 20. Second straight year that they use a pretty high draft pick on a corner. Obviously, they picked Joey Porter Jr. at the top of the second round last year. That pick, in hindsight, has looked like a pretty good one so far. And now they're going to add a big-time piece across from him. Wiggins has really good size and length. Very intriguing playmaker. Solid in the run game as well. And I think corner has to be somewhere that the Steelers address this offseason. Patrick Peterson is slated to be their other boundary corner if they bring him back, which, I mean, the guy's awfully old. I won't be surprised if they don't, or if he just retires. But nonetheless, they've got to get somebody else alongside Joey Porter Jr., and I think Nate Wiggins will be a great pick. Troy Fashanu out of Washington goes to the Miami Dolphins. Teron Armstead's not getting any younger. Fashanu, I think, can play at guard early on and then eventually be groomed to be the long-term left tackle. I think this pick would make a lot of sense for the Dolphins. Again, you got to protect your golden goose. They're about to pay Tua Tagovailoa, so they need to treat him like a $300 million plus asset. Tyler Guyton out of Oklahoma goes to the Eagles, another guy who had a strong Senior Bowl week. The Eagles always plan ahead on the offensive line. And look, Lane Johnson is getting up there in age, so this is going to be the heir apparent for him at right tackle, replacing an Oklahoma Sooner with another Oklahoma player. Jer'Zhan Newton's fall finally comes to an end. He goes to the Texans here at 23. I still think he definitely goes in the first round, but I don't think he was as dominant this year as he was last year as a sophomore. And it doesn't help that he's a little bit undersized, obviously, as well. I think he's going to be an awesome fit, though, in the Texans' defense. Sheldon Rankins along the interior had a great season last year, so if you put a legitimate, possible blue-chip talent in that spot, I think he could end up really playing well in DeMeco Ryans' scheme. And then Jordan Morgan goes to the Cowboys here at 24. Dallas doesn't have a ton of blaring holes on their roster, but Tyron Smith is getting older, and Dallas, obviously, the strength of this team over the last decade plus has been the offensive line. That's been Dallas's thing. They consistently draft offensive line high because they recognize how important it is. And I think Jordan Morgan could be a very good long-term replacement for Tyron Smith at left tackle. Let's round out the first round now, starting with the Green Bay Packers, and they'll take Cooper DeJean, the cornerback out of Iowa, a very intriguing playmaker, somebody who I think you can put in a variety of different spots along your defense. The Packers roster is in a really good spot long-term. They've got a ton of young talent, but I think they could use some more in the secondary, and Cooper DeJean should be exactly that, whether they play him at corner or safety. Edgerrin Cooper, the linebacker out of Texas A&M, goes to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. This pick might feel a little bit like a surprise, not a guy who's really been mocked in the first round. I had him in the first round of my last mock going to the Steelers. This time I have him ending up in Tampa Bay. He had a really good junior season with the Aggies, and I think he absolutely could be in play for the first round, especially to a team like the Bucs, who very strongly value off-ball linebacker. This is the same team who used a top 5 pick on Devin White, who, might I add, is a free agent. I don't anticipate they'll bring him back. Levante David, getting up there in age, also a free agent. And the Buccaneers were willing to use their first-round pick last year on Jack Campbell. It came out when they were getting ready to pick that their guy was obviously Kalijah Kancey, but had he been selected, Jack Campbell was their backup plan. So if they're willing to pick Jack Campbell at 19, I don't have a problem with Edgerrin Cooper here at 26. The Cardinals get Amarius Mims, the tackle out of Georgia, here at 27. DJ Humphries could be out the door. You move Paris Johnson over to left tackle, and you have Amarius Mims play right tackle. Only played 7 games this past season, but has been really solid throughout his career at Georgia when he's been on the field, which has been the question with him, but a talented player adding to the Cardinals' offensive line. The Bills here at 28 pick Ladd McConkey, the wide receiver out of Georgia. Dominant route runner. He was really good at the Senior Bowl. The Bills need guys who can just get open and be consistent. Yes, it's nice having a guy like Gabe Davis who can pop off every 6 or 7 weeks, but it's not ideal when he goes silent the rest of the way. McConkey's numbers aren't going to be all that impressive. That's because he played in a Georgia offense that really focused on running the ball and had Brock Bowers as the number one option in the passing game. But when McConkey gets involved, he's a big-time pass catcher, and I think he could absolutely be in play for the first round. The Detroit Lions at 29 select Graham Barton, the tackle out of Duke. Obviously, defense is a bigger issue for the Lions than offense, but I think they could look to improve the offensive line. Graham Barton's a guy who I think has the versatility to play multiple positions, and whether it's tackle, guard, even center, I think he could see playing time for Detroit. Taylor Decker's not getting any younger. He's in his 9th NFL season. Look at guard. Jonah Jackson, free agent. Graham Glasgow, free agent. I would expect maybe one of those guys is back, but probably not both of them. So I think offensive line very well could be in play, and getting a guy like Barton who can play at guard early on and eventually possibly be a long-term starter at tackle once Taylor Decker is gone, I think this makes sense. Darius Robinson out of Missouri goes to the Ravens here at pick 30. I really like the fit on this defense. Robinson's a versatile player who can play inside and out. Had a really solid season this year, but really made a name for himself at the Senior Bowl where he was one of the better defensive linemen. And Baltimore, they care about having guys up front who can get after the quarterback. Justin Madubuike not under contract next year. So especially if he's gone, I think this could be a route they look at. The Niners at 31 go with Dominic Pooney, the tackle out of Kansas. Not a guy who's really been on anyone's first-round radar, but a guy who was really consistent throughout the year. Really, really good pass protector. The Niners don't have many holes, but I think tackle's a spot they could look at. And with all the other tackles gone, rather than looking at a different position, I think there's a real shot that Dominic Pooney could play himself into first-round conversation. Pretty solid at the Senior Bowl. And I think his name is going to continue to rise over these next few weeks as we get closer to the Combine. And then Kansas City at 32, they need some more guys on offense. They're going to get Troy Franklin, the speedster, out of Oregon. As a Duck fan, I really hope Troy Franklin gets drafted by the Chiefs because this would be such an awesome fit. I'm not going to say he'll be Tyreek Hill, but the Chiefs can try to use him as their Tyreek Hill, their deep threat who can stretch the field vertically and open up opportunities for other guys in the short area game. I think this would be a home run pick for Kansas City if he falls here. I would be surprised if the Chiefs don't go receiver here in first round unless they get somebody else who slips to them unexpectedly. Now on to day 2. We're going to move a little bit quicker now. The Panthers at 33, another team who has to get some pass catchers. For the love of God, help Bryce Young, please. I have them going with Jalen Polk, a guy who I think the league is going to be higher on than the media. Polk has been overshadowed by Rome Odunze at Washington, but he's a really, really good player in his own right, and I think he'd be a good fit in Carolina's offense. Brian Thomas Jr. finally off the board here to New England at 34. There's a good shot Brian Johnson probably does end up in the first round. Very talented physical receiver. Little bit of questions with him in terms of his ability to separate, which is why I have him falling to the second round. But you're reuniting Jayden Daniels with Brian Thomas Jr., and I would be excited to see these guys reconnect in New England. I think that'd be a lot of fun. Kool-aid McKinstry, the corner out of Alabama, goes to the Cardinals here. McKinstry's stock has kind of slipped a little bit. It's not that he had a bad season at Alabama at all. He had a really good season and has gotten better each season with the Crimson Tide. I think I would probably personally still pick him in the first round, but I think there are just other corners that have been more impressive over the past season or so who have more physical ability. Kool-aid McKinstry isn't necessarily some elite athlete, but I think this will be a great pick for the Cardinals who need some more talent in the back end. The Washington Commanders get Braylon Trice, edge rusher out of Washington. They traded away Chase Young. They traded away Montez Sweat. They need more guys going after the quarterback in the worst way. Chris Jenkins out of Michigan joins Jim Harbaugh with the Chargers. I think Chris Jenkins is one of the most underrated prospects of this draft cycle. Really, really good player. Michigan's defense was so much better with him on the field. This is a ridiculous athlete who I think has got the chance to really improve long-term. And now you repair him up with his former college coach, Jim Harbaugh. The Titans at 38 get Kamari Lassiter, corner out of Georgia. They're another team who's going to need more talent in the back end. They've tried to invest high-end draft picks in the secondary with guys like Christian Fulton and Caleb Farley. It hasn't really worked out, so they're going to test their luck here with Lassiter. The Giants go with Christian Haynes, guard out of UConn. They appear to have their long-term tackle duo with Andrew Thomas and Evan Neal, the latter of whom really hasn't played all that well so far in his career, but I think the Giants certainly still believe in him. They could use some more guys inside, though. They drafted John Michael Schmitz in the second round last year. He's obviously at center. I could see them looking at guard with Christian Haynes, who's been a solid starter for UConn over the last few years. And then Washington's back on the board here at pick 40. They got this pick from the Montez Sweat deal. I've been picking Xavier Worthy, the receiver out of Texas. There are a handful of receivers who have really started to slip down the board, but I think Washington's going to like to add Worthy to this offense, an intriguing, dynamic playmaker who I think is going to open things up for the other receivers, and obviously Drake Maye at quarterback. The Packers got this pick from the Jets in the Aaron Rodgers trade, and they're going to pick BYU offensive tackle Kingsley Suamataia, a talented physical player who's got some work to do, but I think he's got the long-term athleticism to be really good. And the Packers are a team who have really developed offensive linemen, young offensive tackles well over the last few years, and I think he very well could be the long-term replacement for David Bakhtiari. This is where things get fun. This is quarterback territory here in round 2. And I have the Vikings picking J.J. McCarthy out of Michigan. I wouldn't be surprised to see Minnesota go the veteran route. I wouldn't be surprised to see them bring back Kirk Cousins. Even if they do bring back Kirk, I really think they're going to look to add somebody younger. I think they'd love to move up for one of the top guys. I don't think that's going to work. So here in the second round, you get J.J. McCarthy to fall to you, a guy who is a proven winner, and I'm skeptic of his long-term NFL future, but he's got the tools, and if Minnesota's patient with him and doesn't rush him in there, I think he could potentially be pretty good. Adisa Isaac out of Penn State goes to the Atlanta Falcons. There is some chatter about him possibly being the top Penn State edge rusher off the board ahead of Chop Robinson. Isaac, I think, is a little bit more polished as a player, and Atlanta needs talented pass rush in the worst way. They need guys who can make plays this year. Going back to quarterback, the Raiders get Michael Penix Jr. out of Washington. I think Penix is going to go later than people expect. I think the media is higher on him than the league, and it's understandable. Michael Penix had a great season this year with Washington, finished in second for the Heisman, obviously led them to the national championship, and he is a great story, but he's an older prospect, and most of all, the medical red flags are a real concern. Nonetheless, I could see somebody taking a shot on him. If the Raiders don't add a veteran quarterback in the offseason, I think Michael Penix could very much be in play for them. The Saints select Keon Coleman, wide receiver out of Florida State. The Saints front office, they're an interesting bunch. It wouldn't surprise me to see them throw a dart on the dartboard, such as picking a guy like Keon Coleman, and hope that the physical tools develop and it works out. Michael Thomas probably won't be back next year. You have Chris Olave, who I think can be a legit number one. Rashid Shaheed's a cool player as well. But taking a flyer on Keon Coleman here in the second round, I think could be an interesting idea. Ricky Pearsall out of Florida goes to the Colts. Really surefire hands. Very solid season this year with the Gators, and he performed well at the Senior Bowl. I think the Colts bring back Michael Pittman. I think they'd be foolish not to. They've really tried to draft receiver on day 2 often, and they've gotten mixed results. The Michael Pittman pick was a win. The Josh Downs selection is looking pretty good so far. The Alec Pierce pick a couple of years ago, maybe not so much, and I think they could use more than other consistent, surefire possession receiver such as Ricky Pearsall. Ennis Rakestraw Jr. goes to the Giants. He ends up slipping a little bit. Not really his fault. Again, it's just kind of how the board played out and a lot of the other corners slipping. So the Giants are going to capitalize on the value here. I think he's a pretty talented player coming off a strong season this year at Missouri, helping the Giants out in the back end. And now Jacksonville here at 48. You guys get your receiver, A.D. Mitchell out of Texas. I think I had the Jaguars getting Mitchell in the first round of my last mock. The more I think about it, I think he's going to go in the second round. Another guy who is physically very talented, but has had some consistency issues throughout his college career at Texas and even dating back to Georgia over the last couple years. Another guy who isn't an elite separator. I think that could scare some teams off, But here in the second round, I think it's worth a flyer here for the Jaguars, who, again, obviously need wide receiver really badly. I got the Bengals picking T'Vondre Sweat out of Texas. Sweat has gotten some first-round buzz. I think for now, I feel most comfortable putting him in the second. There are some concerns about his weight. He's currently listed at around 360 pounds, so I think seeing what he measures in at the combine is going to be really important. But still an ultra-talented player, very good against the run, improving against the pass. And I think the Bengals could look to get younger within the interior defensive line. The Eagles at 50 get Mikey Sainristil out of Michigan. Might feel a little bit early for him because he's undersized, but he's such a good football player, and that's what the Eagles need in the secondary. I don't know where you're going to play Sainristil, whether it's safety, whether it's outside corner, in the box, or most likely in the slot. But he was phenomenal this year for Michigan and has been really solid over the last couple of years. And they need some playmakers in that secondary because that unit was not good last year. Tyler Nubin, safety out of Minnesota, goes to the Rams. Wouldn't be surprised to see him go earlier than this, but that's just kind of how the board played out. Very, very solid cover safety. I think the Rams obviously need secondary pretty badly. Not a particularly good unit. And now you get somebody who can be your center field type of safety. Zach Frazier, center out of West Virginia to the Steelers. Another guy with center and guard flexibility. He's got versatility within the interior of the offensive line. For the Steelers, though, I think he probably does play center. Chop Robinson out of Penn State goes to the Dolphins. He's an intriguing athlete, but he is a little bit raw, a little bit disappointing this year as a junior with Penn State, so his stock slips a little bit, but the consistent flashes have been there, which is why I still think he ends up in the first two rounds. The Eagles go back to Michigan with Junior Colson, the linebacker. Yes, the Eagles are using a somewhat high pick on a linebacker. Who would have thought? Junior Colson's a really solid player. He's got good size, 6'3", 250, solid in the run game, solid in coverage. I think I could see Howie breaking off his ways a little bit because the linebacker play for the Eagles was so bad last year. He recognizes that they need some talent in there, and Junior Colson here I think would be worth the pick. Jonah Ellis out of Utah goes to the Cleveland Browns, a guy who I've been high on. Really talented, versatile player, very, very good pass rusher, had some really dominant games this year. And the Browns could use some more guys up front. Obviously, they've got Myles Garrett, who is going to win the Defensive Player of the Year, but I think they could use a little bit more, and I think Jonah Ellis here would be really good value. Dallas at 56, we've got our first running back off the board. Tony Pollard's a free agent, and Jerry Jones has made it clear that he wants to focus on building this team to win a championship ASAP. Instead of paying a running back, I think that means drafting a running back, and it is Trey Benson, the top one off the board. Really, really smooth runner. He's been really solid for Florida State over the last couple of years. I think he's got some long-term receiving upside as well, and I think he could very well end up as the best running back in this draft. And you give Dallas another playmaker on that offense, really opens things up for the passing game. Obviously, Tony Pollard's a good player, but if you can get somebody who can be a more consistent, true runner like Trey Benson, I think that offense becomes that much more scarier. 8 picks to go. Let's wrap this up strong. That starts with the Packers, who picked Tyke Smith, the talented defensive back out of Georgia. You think the Packers can help themselves seeing a talented Georgia DB on the board? Tyke Smith, I think, could be a pretty versatile player. Wouldn't be surprised to see him get a lot of snaps in the slot for Green Bay. Chris Braswell out of Alabama goes to the Bucs. A little bit underwhelming at the Senior Bowl, but still a talented pass rusher. Had 13 sacks this year. Really improved getting after the quarterback. I think his stock isn't as high as I kind of thought it was a few weeks ago, but still a top 64 pick. Roman Wilson, wide receiver out of Michigan of the Texans. Speaking of Senior Bowl, big winner this week. Roman Wilson was ultra impressive. I don't know how C.J. Stroud feels about having 2 of his top 3 targets having played at the University of Michigan, but I think Nico Collins, Roman Wilson, and Tank Dell are all going to complement each other pretty well because they all have different things that they're good at. Austin Booker out of Kansas goes to the Bills. A raw player with only 1 year of experience, but he showed a lot of flashes this year with the Jayhawks, and I think his best football is ahead of him. I think he's got a lot of upside. Renardo Green, corner out of Florida State, goes to the Lions. I think the Lions are really going to hammer corner in free agency. that position is the reason why the Lions are not in the Super Bowl right now. It's really that simple. You cannot go into next year trotting out Cameron Sutton and Kindle Vildor as your starting corners. If one of like Jalen Johnson or L'Jarius Sneed hits the market, I think the Lions will be all over that. Realistically, neither of those guys do, but I could very well see the Lions looking to spend on that next level of corner, maybe even on two. And I still think they look to add some in the draft. Renato Green's a guy whose stock is, I think, quietly going up. Had a solid senior season this year with the Seminoles. TJ Tamp out of Iowa State goes to the Ravens. Corner's definitely a need for Baltimore. Marlon Humphrey's getting older. He's showing signs of regression, and there isn't a ton else there. Brandon Stevens has shown some good things, but I think they need to add another guy in that room, and I think TJ Tampa is a pretty talented player. At 63, I've got the Niners selecting Marshawn Kneeland, the edge rusher out of Western Michigan. The Chase Young trade has been kind of a flop. Obviously, they're in the Super Bowl, so they don't really regret it, but not necessarily because of the impact that Chase Young has made. I don't think he's going to come back next year, but I do think it's clear that they want another big-time pass rusher next to Nick Bosa, and I think Marshawn Kneeland would be a pretty solid pick. And then Kansas City, wrapping things up at 64, they get Jatavion Sanders, the tight end out of Texas. Whether or not Travis Kelce retires, I think is pretty irrelevant here. The guy's 34 years old. You know he's not going to be around that much longer, maybe another year or two at most. Why not get the long-term replacement groomed for him early? I think it's going to be vital to keep a good tight end in this offense because that's been such a staple for them since they drafted Patrick Mahomes. And even when Alex Smith was here, Travis Kelce was such an important piece in that offense. So I think having somebody who can possibly learn behind him would be really useful. And I think Jatavion Sanders is very clearly the next best tight end on the board. There are a handful of notable players who I don't have going to the top 2 rounds, especially a receiver. Tez Walker, Xavier Legette, Brendan Rice, Johnny Wilson, Jamari Thrash, Malachi Corley, all guys who I could see going here. The surprises, I would say, are definitely Tez Walker and Xavier Legette. Walker had a rough Senior Bowl week, and I was lower on his stock anyway. I don't think he's a top 2 round guy. And then Xavier Legette, another guy who I feel like I'm going to be a little bit lower on. He was listed at 6'3", comes to the Senior Bowl. It turns out he's 6'1". Not ideal. There are a couple of intriguing tackles on the board early for the 3rd round. Kiran Amagaji from Yale. You've also got Patrick Paul out of Houston. He had a slightly disappointing Senior Bowl. Otherwise, I think he probably would have been picked here. A couple of good Miami defenders. Cameron Kitchens, Leonard Taylor, both still on the board. I thought about Peyton Wilson, the linebacker out of NC State, in a couple spots. Some defensive linemen as well, such as Brandon Dorless from Oregon, Dwayne Carter from Duke, Rook Aurora from Clemson, and there's probably a handful of other players who I didn't even mention here who very well could be in play for the top 2 rounds or shortly after. So that'll wrap up the episode. Let me know what you thought of the mock draft down below in the comments section. What picks did you really like? What picks didn't you like? The podcast, of course, the next episode is going to be coming out sometime this week. Nickinator and I will be going over running backs and receivers in this draft class, so that should be a lot of fun, and obviously we'll be talking about plenty of other stuff as well. Make sure to leave a like, make sure to subscribe to the channel if you're new. Peace out.